Today in the EU, final push for corporate due diligence law with major compromises. EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive faces rising opposition since its final draft was provisionally agreed in December, but has been fighting for its survival after a last-minute change of heart from a number of member states, fearing negative business impact. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori, and this is Today in the EU. To break down the importance of this legislation and the scenarios regarding the vote on the revised proposal on March 15th, we invited in the studio Euractiv's economy editor, Anna Brunetti. Hi, Anna. We know that the terms due diligence and corporate sustainability might be a little bit tricky for most of us to understand. So could you explain a little bit what we will be talking about today and why is this directive so important?
So the directive is the result of long-standing campaigns by human rights, labor rights, environmental NGOs, and politicians as well from the parliament to hold companies accountable for what happens through their supply chain. And it makes it much more relatable to think it that way. If we think that the clothes we buy, the phones we buy, the food we eat, the companies that we pay to fuel our heating, lighting, cars, there's a lot of that actually entails really complex and extended production chains. These chains, supply chain, value chain, they often originate in countries far from Europe, but they do have real-life impacts on non-European workers and their living environments.
And what was there before? What was happening before this legislation was proposed?
Before this law was proposed, there was not a single piece of EU legislation in place to guarantee that companies selling their products and services to European consumers were legally responsible for any wrongdoings in their value chain.
So this legislation is the one that sets plafonds on what people have to follow, or what does it do exactly?
There's been a lot of debate and a lot of changes within the negotiation process. So it started from, a level of standards that was quite ambitious. At this moment, we have international guidelines mainly set out by the OECD. But the difference, obviously, with having EU legislation is that it makes it mandatory and binding. And also, the real difference it makes is that it's no longer only for court cases and for people or NGOs to take on the battles against wrongdoings. There's a legislation that requires a more long-term approach to how companies change and improve their supply chains. So it's really a longer-term sustainability process that makes companies more accountable in their daily practices rather than leaving it up to lawsuits.
Right, and you're referring to lawsuits now, but do you have any examples that could paint a clearer image for us?
Yeah, actually, there are a few really somber and really high-profile cases that maybe people can relate to a little bit more. One big tragedy was in 2013. There was this 8-floor building collapsing. It was a textile warehouse in Bangladesh. The name was Rana Plaza. Workers there were producing garments for companies including Benetton, Primark, Mango, Matalan. As many as 1,134 workers died. Another 2,500 workers were injured. So we can see the extent to which this kind of supply chains, wrongdoings, and the real life effects that they can have. Another one was, for example, from French energy company Total, is an energy giant. They were sued for human rights violation in Uganda, where for 3 to 4 years, several inhabitants were, because of land grabbing, they were deprived of their means of sustenance, which resulted in food deprivation, shortage of other essential goods. So that's also a really interesting case. Another one that we can think of and it affects product that is obviously a consumer favorite, which is cocoa and chocolate. But we could also talk about coffee, which is another food staple that is heavily under scrutiny across the supply chain. So in 2021, a U.S. court initiated a trial against Nestlé, Mars, Mondelez, and other big chocolate companies because of a few detected cases of child slavery. So that's another thing that can really get us thinking about why increasing scrutiny and accountability across supply chains is super important.
Now, very briefly, when was the text proposed and how did we get here?
So, yeah, the parliament had been considering proposal for some time. They have a responsible business group unit, but it was only in 2019 when actually Didier Reinders took up the issue, and he kind of added to his speech to become commissioner for justice. So after he was confirmed, then the commission took the mandate in 2020, but it took a couple of years to then turn it into a proposal. If you think of how, the law really revolutionizes the way that corporate practices and corporate accountability is handled, the consequences from a business perspective are huge and far-reaching. So obviously entailed a lot of complicated analysis. So the proposal finally came in 2022. And since then, it's been a really uphill political battle because of obviously what we've talked about.
Conflict of interests, or?
I guess like business constituencies at the national level, large business associations, big business in general. But also it's interesting to see how the law evolved. Many large companies were actually being sued in many jurisdictions for really severe wrongdoing. So there was a lot at stake, and I think politically it was really sensitive, and it still is if we look at what is happening at the moment.
So is this a reason why there is so much resistance to this law now?
2 weeks ago, actually, the Belgian diplomats who are, holding the presidency of the council, they really took a realpolitik approach, and they went back to the text and started slashing through the text, making a lot of concessions, to the point that at this stage it's really difficult to justify continued resistance to embrace the law.
Because it's too watered down?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the scope has been reduced quite significantly. So it used to cover companies from 250 employees up, and now it only affects companies starting from 1,000 employees and 300 millions of annual turnover, which significantly reduces the scope. But also the entry into force has been staggered across 5 years. So the companies between 1,000 and 3,000 employees and with a turnover of between 300 and 900 millions will only be affected from 5 years on. From entry into force. So
not much is changing now.
Not now. And also there's been a lot of other tweaks that mean a reduced due diligence requirements on different parts of the supply chain.
Such as?
The financial sector. There was a political statement that was due to come to revise the possible inclusion of financial sector that has been scrapped. There was a clause for managers' remuneration incentives, which would have kind of incentivized manager to follow and monitor their transition plan more closely and respond on those plans. But that has been scrapped as well. So you could argue that that piece of corporate governance has been taken away. And for one of our sources, for example, that was the only piece in new law that actually talks to corporate governance. So far, we have reporting requirements and disclosure requirements, but that was a very important initial step towards governance, and that's not there anymore. So there have been a lot of concessions that can already be claimed as victories from, the parties that have been pushed for watering down, and there's not much justification left.
So what's the argument that you encounter mostly?
One of the arguments that is being used the most is that SMEs will be unduly affected, but that is now sounding like a very outdated argument because, first of all, they're not directly affected. They're out of the scope now completely and fully. But also the indirect burden that comes from them dealing as either suppliers or buyers to larger companies across the supply chain, that's also been tackled because this law actually solves pre-existing issues for smaller companies by requiring larger companies that deal with them to take care of the administrative costs of due diligence, sometimes financial costs, but also to give them resources to deal with due diligence and also guarantee fairer contractual terms with smaller companies. So it actually proposes more solutions than others.
And you mentioned already that the Belgian presidency has done a lot of work on this legislation. What can we expect? What's the future for it?
So on Friday, we should finally see a vote that has been postponed for 4 times now in the past few weeks.
There is significant public pressure from business and civil society to do so. Instead, member states are listening to a minority of extreme business voices who have so far rejected every proposal and continue to do so.
said Lara Wolters, MEP with the Social Democrats from the Netherlands, who serves as the rapporteur of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, addressing the delays of the Council in a press conference in the previous month.
The reason why it has been postponed is that some member states that were previously backing the legislation and that could really tilt the vote in one way or the other have then kind of signals that they would have U-turned on the backing of the law.
Who are these member states?
Well, the largest one will be Germany. Germany has kind of pivoted towards obstructing the law when its internal constituencies, represented by the Liberal Party, FDP, has become really vocal and active against it. And they managed to kind of work to build a larger stance, which spread to other countries, but there were pre-existing resistance in other countries. For example, France has been quite active in getting the financial sector to be excluded from the law, upping the scope of the legislation to companies with 5,000 employees or above, which would then ally to their national law. And the Italian case is a little bit more obscure.
So what's happening with Italy?
So there's been ongoing resistance. It looks like it's more of a political effort to talk to the electorate, to the national electorate, in pre-electoral times. So in my personal chat to Urso, who's the Minister for Businesses, Enterprise and Made in Italy, he was signaling that they were still resisting to backing the law, even though the Belgian negotiators were already proposing a substantially amended text. So it continued to signal to me as well that they were really going to continue to push for more concessions, even though the window for further negotiations is virtually non-existent at this stage. If you think that usually it is the trilogue stage, the actual phase that is meant for negotiations between co-legislators. After that wraps up, which for this law happened in December, co-legislators are not really meant to substantially amend the text. It's more for smaller or language-related
to finalize the...
Exactly.
As the European elections approach, there is still time for member states to get their act together and to stop blocking this law. But that time is rapidly running out.
Mentioned Lara Wolters, S&D MEP.
But what we're seeing is a trend towards using this stage for political trade-offs and further bargaining. So many of our sources have kind of brought up the problem.
Right. What did they say? What's the problem?
The only elected legislator, which is the parliament, at this stage is not as involved as before. So clearly, if it becomes a political game among national ministries, then it really poses an accountability problem.
And what should we keep in mind regarding this topic?
I guess what we could remind politicians is that it's no longer just an issue of swooping their potential constituencies or big businesses, but it's really about thinking and accounting for the social costs that every legislation they talk about could have.
Thank you, Anna, for breaking down for us this very important piece of legislation. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Today in the EU. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news. Sign up for our podcast newsletter. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by myself, Miriam Saenz de Tejada, and Nicoleta Yonta. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.